Hello, this is my book review for environmental science, spring of 2019. The book I decided to read was The World Without Us by Alan Weisman. A little bit about the book. It was published in 2007 by Thomas Dunne Books, St. Martin's Press in New York, New York. A little bit of recognition for the book. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Orion Prize. It was named the best nonfiction book of 2007 by Time Magazine, Entertainment Weekly, and the National Post of Canada. It was the #1 nonfiction audiobook in 2007 on iTunes, and it was Barnes and Noble's best politics and current affairs book of 2007. From some international recognition, it also got the winner of the Wenjin Book Prize of National Library of China. A little bit about the author, Alan Weisman. He was born March 24th, 1947. He's an author and a journalist, as well as an instructor at several universities throughout his career. He was a professor at the University of Arizona from 2004 to 2013. He also taught writing at Prescott College and Williams College. He's currently a Fulbright Scholar in Columbia. He graduated from Northwestern University. He loved science, but he was never very good at it, so he pursued his career in journalism. But a lot of the books that he writes about are much like this, where it's just this deep dive into environmental science and other things that do affect the world. A little bit about the book. It answers an age-old question that's plaguing many Greenpeace activists today. What would happen to the Earth if we no longer existed? Kind of answering the question of, do we do more good to the Earth or more bad to the Earth? And is the Earth better without us, or it doesn't need us to survive? The author, Mr. Weisman, examines the scientific views on what would happen to many of man-made structures if no one was around to take care of them anymore. He also examines what would happen to other creatures if humans no longer walk the Earth. And honestly, some of it is positive and some of it is negative. But obviously, there's more positive to a lot of the creatures and organisms that inhabit the Earth if we no longer interfered, with very little negative effect on it. The important thing to keep in mind about this book is that it's all hypothetical. He doesn't have any foregone conclusion or knowledge of some sort of catastrophic event that's going to occur, that's going to end man life, or does he predict that this is going to happen one way or another. He's just essentially sets up a scenario in the prelude called A Monkey Koan, and he talks about how if a virus wiped out humanity, or if there was a misanthropic evil wizard that cast a curse on mankind and prevented them from reproducing, and then all man just eventually grew old and died out, what would happen to the rest of the earth, nature, the animals, the plants, the organisms, the ocean, the atmosphere, everything that encompasses our planet? What would the reaction be if the top of the food chain in humanity were no longer existent? Also in the prelude, he kind of starts off by examining a South America tribe by the name of Zapara, and he focuses on an elderly woman who kind of epitomizes the culture which is stuck in a stone age, while the rest of the civilization around it has moved on, and kind of this culture, this tribe, kind of lives with the land instead of off the land, and it kind of allows everything around it to kind of thrive as well in a niche ecosystem that it's created. In the first chapter, to kind of summarize each chapter, chapter 1, you have a lingering, it's called A Lingering Scent of Eden. Beatwez Pushka is a protected forest in the Soviet Union, but it wasn't always that way. For a long time, it was the central ground for hunters, poachers, and wars were fought here as well. And it kind of destroyed a lot of the ecosystem, a lot of the creatures, the plants, the land, everything that kind of surrounded it. It slowly killed off the forest. And then a few years ago, they noticed that there was about 10 times more biodiversity in this forest than anywhere else in the country, and it was the last home of all 9 European woodpecker species. So they deemed it kind of how we do with our national parks, off limits to civilization in order to preserve what was left. And what they did notice over the last several decades since they've done this is that the forest has started to regain its strength and expand beyond its current constraints due to people leaving the nearby cities and villages and going elsewhere. So the forest kind of expanded beyond what its current constraints are, which kind of leads us into how the earth would react if humanity were to leave it alone. In chapter 2, on building our home, it follows a mass event that ends human life, and the world begins to heal itself. Nature wants revenge. We've deteriorated nature, and we've kind of taken control of how we see fit. So what nature is going to do, it's going to deteriorate us, as in our homes, our structures, our creations. And over about 50 to 100 years, a lot of what we know as cities and society are going to slowly decompose and become nothing and be absorbed back into the earth. After about 500 years, depending on what material the city and villages and whatnot were built of, you'll begin to see open land, open landscape, trees regrowing, grass regrowing, everything kind of coming back to where it once was. So when all is said and done, Earth will go back because it doesn't need us. We need it to survive. In chapter 3, The City Without Us, it takes the largest city in the United States, New York City, and kind of observes, build upon chapter 2, where it says, all right, it dives into the scientific structure and breakdown of certain metals, woods, and materials. It really focuses on how water will react, especially to the subway systems. And if the subway systems are washed away in a road, then the structure is going to cave in, and a lot of the roads and structures are going to fall back within the earth, and they're going to decompose, dissolve over time, erosion, and everything's going to kind of fold back in and be covered with a new, fresh layer of soil. They said it would take about 500 years, based on the information they had, for New York City to become one of the most prosperous cities in the world, back to the wildlife it once was before we inhabited the location. In chapter 4, The World Just Before Us, this chapter discusses the glacier movements and the coming of the next ice age, which they say is currently about 2,000 to 3,000 years overdue. We're within a certain ice age period right now, but it's not nowhere near the effect that the last one had. And they're saying that it'd take over 100,000 years without us for CO2 levels to return to its normal state that it was before us. We kind of look at that as the climate change and the global warming effects, and what we've done to society in order to what we've done to the atmosphere, not society, the atmosphere, and how it's reacted to us introducing fossil fuels and hairsprays and other chemicals within the atmosphere. It's kind of deteriorated the ozone and created this hole that's delayed the ice age. And because it's delayed the ice age, it's having a negative effect, especially on humans with cancer, creation from high UV rays, this chapter kind of just dives into how man has evolved from chimpanzees, apes, stuff like that, and grown to adapt to its environment. And because we've adapted to the environment, we've kind of led it to destroying the environment rather than growing with it like intended. Chapter 5, The Lost Menagerie. Eventually, it says every animal on the planet will one day become extinct. And he kind of shows that animals that lived hundreds of thousands to millions of years ago that we see remnants of today once had a thriving, highly populated species, and eventually over time they died out. So the evolutionists believe that one day every species is going to die out. We have accelerated that process over the last 100 years because about 20% less species today live today than there were over 100 years ago. that we know of, that we've actually discovered. And we have been the direct cause of a lot of those extinction issues between hunting, poaching, deforestry, and all the other things that we've introduced into the environment that wasn't meant to be introduced. The chapter also focuses on what will become of other animal life when we're gone, how they lived before us, how they're going to live after us, whether they're going to prosper or fall out. A lot of it is most animals would double in size. Most animals would kind of grow and be able to form their own niches within the environment that they're in, and very few species are dependent on our survival for their survival. Chapter 6, the African paradox, megafauna. Megafauna is large mammals and creatures that once roamed the earth. They're very few and far between today. Back in the day, we had dinosaurs, we had mammoths, we had animals of predator instinct, and even some large animals that were vegetarians really roamed the earth and kind of took over because they had the land, they had the space to grow, they had the space to flourish. Today, there's very few megafauna left, and most of them are located within the Africa region. The only location that megafauna outside of Africa are usually in the oceans, because the three major oceans cover much of this planet, and they remain very little interference from humankind. And because there's little interference, they've been able to survive and flourish within their own environment without us being able to get in there and tear it apart like we have with a lot of land creatures. Depending on the need for humans to survive, some animals may go extinct while others may evolve and expand in size. Kind of what we were talking about the last chapter, where if we were no longer here, a lot of these animals may double and expand in size because they have more room to roam around the planet. In Chapter 7, what falls apart, the breakdown of buildings and land based on erosion and UV rays if no one were around to maintain them. And most of the chapter breaks down an abandoned hotel to show the progress of change once mankind is removed from the picture. In Chapter 8, what lasts, the chapter dives into civilizations that have been abandoned, like the Mayans and Aztec cultures, and what was left from humanity once they discovered them. And depending on the material, some things will be completely dissolved while others will be very deep underground until something else comes to unearth them. In this chapter, they talk about a hypothetical situation where if an alien life form were to come to this planet before everything were to break down and dissolve, what would they be able to find? How long would it last? And what would they think of our society? In Chapter 9, polymers are forever, it talks about plastics, the effect of plastics currently as we live, and how they affect certain areas around the world, especially within the oceans, because we dump a lot of our plastics in the water. How long they would take to dissolve, that they are dissolvable, but over a long period of time. And it kind of dives into a little bit of if we haven't created too much, that the earth would be able to, at this point, would be able to absorb or dissolve most of it, but there could be a point where we would deteriorate the soil and the environment around it if we continue on the path that we are. In Chapter 10, the Petro Patch talks about automobiles and other machines requiring petroleum gas or fossil fuels in order to operate. What would happen to them? An example they use is a tank in a washed out, abandoned, and buried in the bank of a lake. What happens to the process of it, how long it took to deteriorate, and what is still left around after so many years that it's been there. In Chapter 11, The World Without Farms, it dives a little more into domesticated animals like cats, dogs, cows, pigs, and horses. What they would do, the two species that it really says would survive without us are cats and horses. They would be able to expand and grow and fend for themselves without much interference. Dogs, cows, and pigs would take a little more adjustment to it based on the domestication and what they become used to over the last several hundred years as we've domesticated the species. It also discusses what would happen to land once humans stop tilling and farming, overrunning it with pesticides and chemicals, and what would kind of related when I read this to what we had learned about in the Dust Bowl, how we had overtilled land so much and how we had destroyed kind of the ground beneath us because we were in out instead of growing and adapting to the land and allowing it to give us what we were able to take from it. When we were able to take from it, we demanded more. And because of that, the earth responded the way it did with the high dust storms to kind of flush out what was killing it. The earth would respond similarly to where if we were no longer here, it wouldn't need to create these things in order to recover itself, that over time it'd be able to recover and flourish and the soil would return back to where it was before. In chapter 11, the fate of ancient and modern wonders of the world, it talks about Great Wall of China, pyramids of Egypt, Mayan and Aztec wonders, Grand Canyon, Mount Rushmore, Easter Island, all these things that have survived the extent of time over hundreds to thousands of years, and what they would look like after several thousand years without mankind being able to maintain them. Most of them would be washed away, eroded, dissolved. They would no longer exist. The earth would somehow find a way to deteriorate it to the point to where it would be unrecognizable, and whatever was left would adapt to what was around it. In chapter 13, The World Without War, chapter is interesting because it discusses things like landmines that were buried centuries ago, how some of them are still active today, but after so long they become deactivated because the mechanisms and the way the ground would kind of deteriorate and get rid of it would make them obsolete after so long. And the majority of the chapter talks about the physical destruction of what we have brought to the land, the chemical environmental destruction of the atmosphere due to things like chemical warfare and nuclear bombs, the fallout of things like Hiroshima back in World War II, and how that's still recovering even after all this time, and how long it would take for the environment to recover due to our war-like nature. In chapter 14, Wings Without Us, it dives into birds, how birds would react to the existence or our non-existence in the world, and how their existence would flourish. Most species would be able to rebound from an extinct state if they had more land to kind of live off of, and they weren't being killed off daily on deforestation, by windows, by windmills, by other things that mankind has created that does not make it a very livable or acceptable environment for birds. There are some that says they would die out because they do depend currently, like pigeons and seagulls. They talk about how they might have more of a rough time without humans around because they do currently, a lot of their tendencies are made up of surviving on the leftovers of humans, and they would have to kind of reacclimate themselves into a non-human environment. Chapter 15, Hot Legacy. What we all want to know, what happens to nuclear power plants when we're gone. Take about 2 weeks, and then you'll have a thermonuclear power facility meltdown, and it would cause a thermonuclear event. The uranium-290 that is used in nuclear power is non-explosive, so you're not going to have things exploding on you. However, you will have a thermonuclear event that would cause pressurization and the release of this uranium-290 within the atmosphere, which would cause high levels of radiation, which would make the atmosphere around it unlivable for an extended period of time. But a lot of what they've done currently, they talked about the after effects of Chernobyl and what happened and what's currently happening even after all these years of what had happened, and how the environment around it is still not livable because of the half-life of uranium. And the fact that they've used mountains, they've actually carved out a mountain to kind of dispose of a lot of this nuclear waste. And even the levels around there have been extremely high for a long time. And after several hundred years, they're predicting that the environment will eventually be able to recover from the nuclear disasters and kind of level itself out and normalize itself once again. Chapter 16, our geological record, talks about the extinct species such as dinosaurs, what we could expect another species to find if they were to dig us up years later. It kind of expounds on the fact that if another life form were to succeed us at the top of the food chain, or an alien race would come and find us, what they would think of humanity, what would be left over depending on the amount of time, and how this would slow down without how things would slow down without the existence of mankind. Chapter 17, where do we go from here? At this point, the author is repeating a lot of what he's already talked about in the chapter. It started within chapter 16, a lot of what he's already talked about in the book. It started in chapter 16, where he had discussed what you kind of revisited what an alien life form or other life form at the top, capable of our thought process, would think of us. At this point, he kind of dives back into the animal species, how they would react, how they would flourish, how they would die out, what would happen to the land masses, atmospheres, ozones, sea life, and since he does describe that most won't even notice that we've left. They'd have no idea we've been gone, except for that we would be able to they would be able to expand beyond what their current restraints are right now. While there are a few species that do kind of depend on us to survive, and they'd slowly die out. That's just the normal process of kind of life on Earth. Chapter 18, Art Beyond Us. Long and short of it is art will no longer exist after a short period of time. So what we hold sacred, what we think separates us from other species, other unintelligent beings, is our ability to express ourselves in the form of art. Well, everything we hold dear about that is going to be gone before much else around the world. So if those species do find us later down the road, they won't have much to go off of because most of the art would be gone. It does talk a little bit about, it describes the situation of I Love Lucy and the television show, and how that was a change for its time, and that kind of exemplified what mankind was. And if somebody were to see that, they'd probably see something similar to what they would expect to find. And it also discusses a little bit about bronzing and how bronze and copper might be the only metals to really survive after all these years. The last chapter, chapter 19, the sea cradle, it basically talks about how sea has been left. The major seas, large oceans, have been left undisturbed for the most part. We have had little interference into them, but there's still a vast amount that we know nothing about. And they called the ocean as a cradle several times throughout the chapter, meaning that it protects most of what resides in it without human interference. So that was the breakdown of the chapters. Some of the analysis, our main objectives. We have very few positive effects of humanity on Earth. One of the big things he says is mankind needs Earth to survive. Earth does not need mankind to survive. So we need Mother Nature, we need Earth, we need the planet in order to sustain success within our species, but the Earth does not need our species to be successful. It actually benefits more without it. But we do help a lot of domesticated animals survive. We do help create that niche within a lot of cultures that a lot of animals and other species and organisms have come accustomed to. And we have the cultivation and advancement of technology and exploration of space. We don't have much else to go off of as our positivity added to this Earth. Some of the negative stuff is humans are killing the land, they're destroying the atmosphere, they're killing off birds and animals at a higher rate than ever. There are so many negative effects that we have on the atmosphere, on the oceans, on ice age, and the melting of the polar caps. We're not doing a very good job at taking care of what we need in Mother Earth to survive. Some of the author's objectives that he was looking for is when we're gone, not much will be left. And after enough time passes, if other species don't replace us, there'll be nothing left to really tell that we once existed on this planet. What we don't understand is little of what we do. Little of what we do actually holds meaning on this planet, and this planet's going to exist well after we're gone. All we're doing is destroying the beauty of the Earth, and we're shortening the lifespan of the planet while we're here. The evolution of species will have another omega supplant us one day, even after we're gone. And if that's true, then even without us, there'll be something, someone, some species that's going to replace us. To kind of break down the plot, there wasn't a lot of plot to talk about in this book. It was kind of one chapter after another of just different situations of what would happen around the world if we no longer existed. There's interrelated sequences of events that kind of overlap each other, but it's a bunch of information that's kind of just stuffed into a novel in an article format. There's no main characters, there's no build up or climax, no twist or downfall of the hero, no Oedipus complex or Achilles heel, just what would happen if humans no longer existed. The theme is in the title. If you ask me, the world without us, the basis of the book is what would happen if we no longer existed. It really dives into the science behind what would happen to everything on Earth, from inanimate objects that man created to the rest of the living organisms and Mother Earth herself, and how they would change once we are gone. The intended audience, it's a very complex and scientific book. If you dive into the details of it, it can get a little dry at times if you're not really into it. So I would say the audience that we're kind of reaching for is somebody that is either an environmentalist or a college student taking a science class or going for the environmental degree, somebody who's interested in what is going on with the planet, a Greenpeace activist, a high school student that really cares about the environment. Other than that, there's not a ton of people that may find this a great read. It's a good read. It might not be captivating if you don't know what you're getting into, if you kind of understand that it's not really a story, it's just a breakdown that answers a question. If you're into the question, then this would probably be the book for you. So I would say in that mid-20 to early 50 age, if you're really into science and the environment, it's really kind of the book for you. What I took through it is I didn't know a lot about the chemical makeup of many man-made objects and found it interesting how he took certain situations around the world that are currently existing and tied it into how that would relate to what would happen on Earth if we no longer existed. One of the tie-ins I kind of saw from it is the movie WALL-E, the Disney movie about the robot that's the last, not really living, but the last thing on Earth that's even has any motion whatsoever as it's trying to clean the planet. And the fact that after several hundred years of absence without mankind, life eventually became sustainable again. The Earth corrected itself. You were able to grow greens once again, even if they thought that the Earth was completely dead. So over time, the Earth will come back. I feel like I was able to understand the book more after taking the first half of this class, and I kind of tied it into a little bit of the Garrett Hardin overpopulation theory, where he talked about if we don't control our population, our resources would dwindle to the point to where we would have a rough time surviving based on what our current resources now and the increase in population that we're moving towards, and kind of said, hey, if we set it to 0, how will those resources come back? And he did kind of talk about how if we were able to balance out and even lessen what the resources would be able to regain from the population expansion that we had, that eventually there'd be enough resources left to handle the increase in population. So it was interesting to kind of tie that into what this book was all about. I also kind of thought about the Lynn White discussion about the ecological crisis we're facing and how it kind of looked at, all right, well, what are we actually doing to the world? What are we doing to this planet? What are we doing to the environment around us? What kind of niches are we creating or getting rid of? And looking at, hey, now we're gone. How does the planet react? Would I recommend it? Short answer would probably be no, because I'm more of a person that likes a story behind a message. I want something that would be able to tell me a story, and in the story relay a message that I can learn from. This was kind of just an extended article that really dove deep into the science behind what the world would do without us. So it was a little dry at times, a little dull here and there, but overall I did find it interesting. I just don't know if I would recommend it to a friend or a colleague. Conclusion and tidbits. The book was constructed initially as an article for a journal. It was asked by a former panelist. So Alan Weisman was a panelist at a conference, and during the Q&A time, he was actually asked by somebody in the audience, what do you think the world would happen without us? And it kind of launched him into, hey, instead of just answering this question, let me find out the answer for you. So he traveled all over the world to gather data for this book. He put it together very well. It was well thought out, a lot of scientific information, and he definitely goes on to thank a lot of those people that helped him, because he says he's not a scientist, he's a journalist, and he really had to kind of rely on others to give him the details he needed in order to put this article together. What does this book prove? It shows that the impact, both good and bad, we have on the earth and its inhabitants, as well as how we think we have damaged the earth to an unrecoverable state. The planet will in fact recover once we're gone. Some animals and organisms are currently not affected by us. Some are extremely affected and would thrive without us, and some would die out if we no longer existed. And what we think are the greatest achievements on the planet will long be forgotten once we are no longer here. Lastly, I'd like to leave you with a couple quotes from the book that really impacted me and stood out as I read it. One, he says, and this was early on, "Without us, earth will abide and endure. Without her, however, we could not even be." He talks about nobility is expensive, non-productive, and parasitic, siphoning away too much of society's energy to satisfy its frivolous cravings. Basically, we don't think about what we do before we do it. We just want, need, and before we know it, the resources that we need in order to survive are gone, and the earth is not really necessarily there to provide us with what we want. We should be living with it. In recent years, a green burial movement has protested formaldehyde, which oxidizes to form formic acid, the toxic and fire ants and bee stingers, as yet one more poison to leach into water tables, careless people polluting even from the tomb. It talks about like ancient Egyptian tombs and what they use in order to preserve the bodies. They're actually leaking into water and landfill to kind of contaminate it, so that even while we're gone, we're still affecting the environment around us. Change is the hallmark of nature. Nothing remains the same. Adapt and survive. The planet will adapt and survive to what we're doing here, and it'll adapt and survive once we're no longer here. The last quote I got is, "The worst happens and life still goes on." As the book kind of talked about, we're not needed for the planet to survive. We're actually hurting it more than we're helping it. And as we diminish, as we fade out, as we no longer exist, the world will actually grow stronger, and it's going to continue to go on even when we're not the dominant species anymore. Thank you again for listening to my book report. I hope you learned a lot about the book and what my analysis was on it. Please let me know if you have any questions. Again, it was a good book. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Like I said, not sure if I'd recommend it, but it was a good read while I had it. And I think I learned a lot, and I was able to apply a lot of what I learned in the class to this book. Thanks again.